My name is Chris Aman, and I'm a live audio mixer based in Nashville, Tennessee. I've been working in audio for about 24 years, and hail originally from Canada, a small city called Medicine Hat, Alberta, and have been in Nashville for quite some time. Over the years, my early days, I was a monitor engineer for Canadian icons April Wine, which moved on to 3 Days Grace, and then got some opportunities and kind of moved into the pop world, which was One Republic, Demi Lovato, Nick Jonas. Got to do a little bit of jam band stuff with the guys from Dispatch, which was amazing. And currently, I've been at home and been able to do a couple of live streams and things with Gabby Barrett recently. And yeah, that's about it for right now. So while I've been locked up, I've been lucky enough to have a mixing studio at home, which I've got a 56 input analog desk. And I still do love the analog world, but absolutely love the digital world and where it's come and the control that I'm able to get, especially in the live world, with these new consoles. When I'm not doing that, I basically spend my days on one of my John Deeres, and I call it John Deere therapy. So I'm either mowing or moving dirt with my tractor and just kind of hanging out, probably having a couple too many beers. Great. So let's take a look at how I set up my desk and also take you through a few of my favorite features that I especially find on the DiGiCo consoles that are extremely important to what I'm able to produce as a live mixer. First off, I've gone and built essentially like a general dummy session that I build all my show files from. So what I've done is I've got every possible input that I could have, which up in the channel list, there's extra things that are in my channel list. When I first go to build a show file, and then I kind of just strip out all the things. So by doing that, I find I can build it a lot quicker because I've already got plugins in place, because I am using some other products, a server and stuff for extra plugins. But by doing that, that saves me a lot of time in the initial setup. And I've also got my plug-in chains and things already in place. One thing I like to do is the left fader bank, and the SD5 is my surface of choice. I really like the layout. I also really like, because I think as I've gotten older, I've gotten a little bit lazier, and having the macros right in front of me, I basically don't move from this position the whole night. So once it's all set up with the VCAs and certain macros to turn things on and off, updating, snapshots, saving sessions, everything is right here. I've got a macro for switching between input A and input B. So if we have to switch to like the spare microphone for the main vocal, I can keep it all in that same channel strip. And all I have to do is hit this button right here, and it'll swap to that second input, therefore keeping any changes that I may have made during the show, be it plugins or EQ, for that microphone. The other part, and this kind of plays into my reasoning for during line check, is I'll set up all my inputs in line so that when we go through the line check, I basically just follow a line bank to bank to bank, and it just makes it really quick and easy to access those. And then over on the right side is where I'll set up my custom layers, and you know, that can be any of the faders that I feel I need to be able to grab or have access to those channel strips throughout the show. I always kind of put into a custom layer on the right bank. And then auxiliaries, effects, certain things that I would grab quickly during a show that I need to do is always in my custom bank over here on the right. The center section, during a show, I will stay on the control groups. And on this certain session, I've dumbed it down a little bit for this, and I'm only using actually 7, and then I've got one set up just for the near fields that we're listening back here, just so I have quick control of it. But normally I would have the other faders banked together, like doing a lot of pop stuff. There's a lot of tracks and things going on, so I would put those on a control group and land those in the center section, so that I always have quick access to those faders. Now I'll go into some of my bus structure and how I kind of lay out bringing things together. One of the things I do, and why I really love the DiGiCo consoles as well, is that in the actual groups, I feel like there's enough processing there between EQ, dynamic EQ, multi-band compression, compressor, whatever you want to do with it, that I'm able to not do another loop through the server and actually do all that right on the desk, which to me is fantastic. So I basically set up, I've got a drum crush, a toms, which I'll get into later. There's a specific reason why I actually bust the toms to its own group. I do a band group, a Vox group, and on the songs that we're going to actually be listening today, it's from the Hanson String Theory tour. So the guys from Hanson, I'm sure you're familiar with, the song Bop, and they did a record with a symphony orchestra. And so when we had the unfortunate ending to the Demi tour, I actually ended up jumping on that with those guys, and it has been, to this date, one of my favorite tours I've ever done. They're some of the nicest guys that you could ever meet, and I didn't realize how talented those guys are. So we did about a year of shows with symphony orchestras, anywhere from 21 to 63 pieces, and I captured all of it. And so I've got approvals to use a couple of songs, and that's what we're going to be listening to today. So in this, the groups, I've also got strings, winds, brass, percussion as separate groups. I always make sure that every input hits the same amount of buses before it goes to the master group. I just do that as a rule because it's easy to keep everything in time of where it's coming in and out of the desk. So in my sessions, I use about 14, a mix of mono and stereo auxes as well, which is all my effects. And I do like 4 snare verbs, and there's a layering, like in this certain song that you're going to hear today. I'm actually using 3 of the 4 on that for the snare drum. Tom verb is a stereo one because I actually pan it so that the verb follows where the tom is panned. And then various instrument verbs, vocal verbs, doublers, short and long delays, and sometimes even more delays, like if there's a certain effect delay that only happens at like one part in the show, I'll actually just set up a separate aux and trigger that most likely from one of the macros and only use it for that point. Turn it on, turn it off, and that's why I love to have the access to that stuff right here. I think we'll have a listen to the song. So this is a song called Tragic Symphony. And it was really cool too because David Campbell did the arrangements for it, and they're stunning arrangements. And it was really cool on the first show that we did at the Greek in LA. He actually was the conductor for that first show, and so it was really cool to work with him and just kind of see the whole thing come to fruition. So let's have a listen. What's going on in the song, and the arrangement of it. This is my first experience actually mixing a full symphony, and so the whole experience was actually a learning experience for me as a mixer as well, trying to put together a 60-piece orchestra in really tough conditions, because we didn't carry PA on this. I did have a console with me, but every day having to deal with some less than spectacular installs and fight through and undo some of the things to try and get a consistency sonically every day. So I carried a lot of processing with me for the outputs, and in order to achieve that every day. It was the most time I've spent tuning the PA in years. So now I think what we'll do is we'll just kind of dive into a few of the things that I personally do, just to get especially like definition. I find the dynamic EQ so important in what I do, in the live realm, and more in the expansion and adding energy. Basically, instead of doing EQ and boosting something like on a snare drum, I'll show you in a second, I'll do that with dynamic EQ. And what I find is by adding 4 to 6 dB, depending on the snare, in the upper mid-range, where you would normally add some cut to it, say, I do that with dynamic EQ, and I find that gives me that extra that I never fight against having the hi-hat bleeding through the snare mic. And so that just kind of brings the whole noise floor down and gives me much more definition in the mix. And on this session, I've actually used that all the way through, even in all the strings, on the groups, and we'll dive into it. I heavily do it with my toms as well. And for those that fight a gate, what I do is the dynamic EQ, but I put it pre-gate, so that when it hits threshold, it actually just gives it that little bit of extra energy to open the gate when you want it to, without having triggers that fail or anything like that. I feel like you can absolutely do it on board, with this desk, and get it to react exactly how you want it to. You can change the threshold, the attack time, all those things. And down once we get to the vocals, I'll show how I use a slower attack time, so that I'm not picking up the transients, but when they sing, it basically just adds that extra gain to punch through where I want it to, but then kind of goes away. Now I'm not fighting with that extra noise that the mic is picking up. So, and I used that a lot on the Demi tour, because that last tour, she was in front of the PA for 80% of the night. And, if I didn't do that and tame it, then that's 5 dB extra noise that I'm just introducing in and regenerating back through the PA. So I've found that the dynamic EQ is the most important part of what I do. So let's jump in on a couple of things. Cool, so let's jump in on some of the drums and stuff. And here on the kick drum, because we had a lot of inputs, we actually only did one kick drum. And because we needed to keep it within a certain amount of inputs. And this is pretty typical. I'm not doing any dynamic EQ on this one, just a pretty typical curve that I would do, scooping out the mids and just, you know, adding a little bit of bottom in the note that I want it to, or how the drum is tuned. And then I go for a little bit more of a natural attack in the kick drum, not as much of a click. But I find boosting in that area, you know, I'm at 2.77 and boosting 7 dB. I just find it a little bit more natural sounding. Here on the snare drum, this is where I start to get into the dynamic EQ. So on the high mid band, I'm actually adding my cut with dynamic EQ. So I've got a boost of 5.5 dB. At 3.7K, and let's just jump in. Oh, apparently I hit a button there. This little SEQ button. So dynamic on, I use a quick attack because obviously I want it to pick up the initial transient, fairly quick release, and then the threshold. I basically set the threshold tight enough that the hi-hat doesn't pick up in it. So I'll just play back and we'll solo that up. So that's just the snare top. And if we turn off that EQ, you can hear it gets a little bit flat, right? I like where that sits, and I do like a meaty snare drum, so I do add a little bit of bottom in on it. A lot of times I'll do that with dynamic EQ. It really just depends, but on this one, I was able to just add, you know, 2.75 dB. It's at about 90 hertz, but one of the things I like to do is I actually will take the high pass filter a little bit higher than what you would think, and then I'll actually put that EQ filter out beyond the high pass filter because I feel it just kind of tapers off that slope a little bit and makes it a little less abrupt, and I'm able to actually get that kind of meaty snare drum out of it. So I'm just going to put this in loop. Snare bottom, pretty typical. Just adding a little bit of the kind of attack and the strainer noise. Sometimes I will actually add a bunch of bottom end to the low or to the bottom snare. It just really depends on where everything fits. So now when we bring them both in together, and then there's a texturing of 3 different reverbs that are going on, but I just use them all subtly in texturing now. So if we go down here, that's dry. One of the other great things about working in the digital world is input delay. So for me, I don't add or I don't flip the phase. I actually will go. I just use. I'm all about just a 57 on top, 57 on the bottom. I don't. Nothing fancy for me. I don't really use any froofy mics. I want to have stuff that I can get wherever I'm at in the world. And if something breaks, then we can always get the same thing. But being able to add input delay. So I'm going to do it with it in, and then I'll turn it off, and you can hear, and I kind of just use that to also shape the tone. And it might not be perfectly in phase and whatever, but I'm looking for certain things that I hear to kind of pop out, but it'll actually cancel out certain other things. And so that's part of where I move it around to find that sweet spot for me of where it is. But if we turn that off, it's not a huge difference, but I feel like the bottom end gets a little bit better. And there's a little bit in the mid-range that kind of just hits you in the face a little bit better. So now, hi-hats, pretty typical stuff. I actually really don't use the hi-hat mic a lot. I do more some pretty heavy compression on overheads, and I actually mic the overheads a little bit closer and try to pick up the kit, because I find it naturally gives space to it just by doing that. And then with some pretty heavy compression, all those little intricacies from the cymbals and the hi-hat and all the things actually come out that I usually don't have to use a lot of the hi-hat mic. So now let's jump in on the toms. I've cut out a little section, and it's just couple of tom hits. And basically I'll show you what it sounds like with the gate on, with the gate off, and then we'll punch the EQ in and out. And these are gated pretty hard. I know in these on these shows he was definitely not hitting as hard as normal. So it probably doesn't come into play as much on this with the dynamic EQ before the gate, but I feel like it'll give you a good idea of how it actually works. So now I'm just going to go, this is with the gate on, and we'll punch the gates out. And so you can hear all that extra noise, snare drum, cymbals, all that stuff that in certain situations, you would be fighting against that. So we'll punch them back in, and we'll go in, and I do pretty typical stuff. So I basically scoop out a bunch of mid. I add a little bit of low where the note of that tom is to accentuate it, and then as well just some attack on the top. But if you look in a little bit closer at the screen, you can see that only when the tom actually hits is it actually boosting and adding that extra energy, which helps open the gate when I want it to. So when you go into here, I'm using a quick attack, fairly quick release, and you can actually change that. So if you want the tom to hang on a little bit longer, or if you want it to be really short and quick, and I do that also on low. And for these ones, -36 is the threshold, and that's where I felt it captured the sound of the tom without being triggered by any other cymbals or snare hits or anything like that. So, and I did the same thing. It's basically almost a copy and paste on the floor tom. The low frequency note is just a little bit lower based on what the note of that drum was. Okay, and then beyond the tom channel strips, I actually do kind of the same thing on my toms group in adding extra expansion to accentuate those areas that I want to really pop out. And then from there, I actually run it into a compressor. So those toms, when they hit, it's just like, boom, it's right in its spot, I find. So that's pretty much what I do there. Overheads is pretty typical stuff. Just high pass filter. Depending on the microphone that I'm using, there will be, some harshness around 4 or 5K that'll take out, but then add a little bit of sparkle, because we all love sparkles. And And then some pretty heavy compression. So on average, I'll end up compressing my overheads probably at least 10 to 12 dB. And I'm doing all that on board the console. Bass, kind of the same thing. I'll high pass and low pass. It obviously depends. If it's bass where there's like some slapping and plucking going on, then I won't. Low pass is low, but I'll use the expansion of the dynamic EQ to basically kind of accentuate when I want it to in the 80 to 200 region and get those notes to kind of pop out. I would probably high pass a little bit higher than the average guy. You know, I'm usually somewhere between 70 and 90 hertz, but obviously it's dependent on the information that we're trying to portray. If it's something that warrants having that really heavy bass bottom end, then I'm not going to go that high. But something like this, I went a little bit higher in that 90 range because I was just trying to clean up space for like the basses, the big, you know, they don't really have any information other than right there where the bass is. So it's just getting those to kind of work together, especially in this this realm. One of the things I did find with mixing the Symphony is all of the instruments in an orchestra are basically meant to already sit in the spectrum where they are. So as far as the inputs on the Symphony, I really didn't have to do a lot of EQ. It was mostly just a lot of high pass and low pass filtering and just kind of cleaning up some of the noise. I also used dynamic EQ on that as well because that allowed me to, with having 100 plus inputs, open mics on stage, I found that really brought the noise floor of everything down, that I was able to really push that Symphony in there and make it a part of the show and make it nice and big. I always feel you can have more cellos because the low mid that they put out, I love the cello. And I also have a new respect for the French horn. There's something about the French horn that I actually began to appreciate that I didn't appreciate before. All of the other basic instrument channel strips, I'm not doing anything crazy. It's, you know, just a little bit of compression here, a little bit of high pass, low pass filtering. Now over here, with the vocals, I was talking about using the dynamic EQ for that and basically expansion. So essentially what I'm using the dynamic EQ for is kind of like an auto gainer and adding input gain so that I don't have to keep that strip up so loud. And when it hits threshold, it kind of just punches it out and then goes away. And now I'm not picking up all the other stuff. You know, I did this heavily on the Demi tour as well. And that helped clean up the vocal a lot with her being in front of the PA most of the night. So right now on this channel strip, I've got a almost 5 dB boost, pretty wide Q at basically 5.5K. And I just find that punches out and helps the vocal just to cut through without having to really gain it up and grab all that extra noise that's going on around it. Just gives you more control and definition, I find. So what I'm going to do is select a little spot here.
Compose this intricate, but if it don't bleed in the end, okay.
So obviously you're hearing some of the drums and some of the stuff in behind. So now if I turn the EQ off,
caught up in a dark emotion, giving you what's left of me, giving me crazy notion.
you can hear that upper mid range and the high frequency just kind of punch through just a little bit. it's subtle. It's just enough to kind of get it to sit out there and kind of cut through all the stuff. So that's off again. So that's essentially, you know, what we're trying to do is just get rid of some of the other noise and give us a little more definition and control. So now I'll show you a little bit of basically just the buses, because there's a lot of other stuff to go through, like as far as with the Symphony. But like I say, I didn't do a ton of EQ on the Symphony. I did do a little bit of dynamic EQ on some of the inputs, just to accentuate them a little bit in certain areas. But I mostly did it on the buses. And here, as you can see, on the strings, basically I did two bands of dynamic EQ. So I did a high mid and a low mid. So the high mid I actually made into a shelf, and basically to just accentuate the top end for cut, because I didn't want to add a bunch of that into the whole mix, because it could get messy really quick. And then also at 148 hertz, fairly wide Q, I added about 5 dB of expansion to the low and low mid, just to add some more meat, especially like cellos and basses and some of those things. Because I really, like I said before, I really enjoyed the low mid that brought to it. So I selected a spot here. We'll just kind of listen to some of the strings, and I'll punch it in and out. So you can hear some of the background noise in there. You hear a little bit of the drums and some of the other things going on, and definitely like where some of the strings were placed, there's little bits of like horns and things that'll kind of peek through in some of those areas. But now I'm going to turn the EQ off, and we'll have a listen, and then I'll punch it in halfway through. I think that gives a pretty, you know, easy explanation of what's going on there. You can hear that pretty clearly. The toughest area that I found was the woodwinds instruments, and that was just a whole, when you've got that much information in the room and trying to get those mics close enough to get it. And so that was probably my biggest struggle in the whole thing, was getting the woodwinds to where I felt like they were really sitting in the mix and a part of it. So again, I basically did a couple of bumps. The low mid, I didn't actually do it with dynamic. I just added a little bit of warmth to it down in the low mid, but added a little bit of that mid range as a dynamic, just to kind of boost it up a little bit, because I was fighting some of those other instruments through there. Brass didn't have any problems with anything. Plenty of gain. So bus is pretty much flat. There was just a little bit of high pass filtering and low pass filtering throughout the brass. And I think the only thing I added some low on was actually the tuba, just to try and get a little bit more meat out of the tuba. Percussion, a lot of different things going on. There was everything from congas to timpanis, bells, glockenspiel, you know. So on this one, and essentially I just did a boost, a wide boost at like 2.5K, just to get some of those, the transient of the drum, the timpani and stuff to kind of just pop through. And so on this one, again, with so many different instruments and things in the spectrum, I feel like I had to get really clinical on where I placed things and how I did it. And guitar was one of those things where, you know, I'm not afraid to, and sometimes I even will high pass and low pass filter it more, it really depending on where it needs to kind of sit and how much stuff is going on. Obviously with a band, like a 3-piece rock band, like you can open that up and not have so much kind of stepping on each other. But in a situation like this, I always say don't be afraid to go a little higher than what you think and clean those things up. One of my other philosophies is don't make the inputs sound good on their own. You know, if you go through and make all your inputs sound great on their own, then when you put them all together, chances are it's going to be a mess. And so I always find that sometimes certain things are ugly, but in my mind, I'm basically kind of trying to visualize and paint the picture in my mind of, okay, where is this going to sit in the spectrum? Where's that going to sit in the spectrum? And then I'll kind of just move it into that spot. And then I find you just don't have to do a lot to it once you've kind of placed it in that spot, which is, I find, a little bit different than mixing a record. But in the live world, I find I have to get much more clinical. And if it doesn't need to be there, for me, it's pretty much gone. I don't want no part of that. So the guitar, I'm at like 269 hertz on the high pass. On this one, I'm at 7K. A lot of times I end up down at like 2-3K, just depending on what information is going on. But this is the part, and I found right at like 1.5K, it just needed just a little bit of a bump EQ wise, just to kind of sit in a spot where it was there but not obnoxious with the rest of the symphony and what stuff was going on. So I'm going to play this. And then if I punch that EQ up, like really not a lot going on. I'm just kind of cleaning up a little bit of the stuff around it and kind of putting it into its spot. This patch you actually did pretty good because I didn't, you know, there's not a lot of a difference that you actually hear. And then once that layers in, this part will just kind of stand out in its place. Taylor's organ, again, pretty simple. It's almost flat. You know, he gave a good tone out of the organ. He was using, I can't even remember what he was using anymore. It was like 1.5 years ago that we actually did this tour. So, but basically just high pass, low pass, and then accentuated a little bit in the low mid, just to warm it up just a hair where I wanted it to, but really pretty simple. Piano, which we'll get into in the next song, I felt his piano patch was a little bit dark and needed to cut a little bit more, so I did a bit of a high shelf on there just to get it to, you know, be present and kind of cut through in the mix. The vocals, other vocals, I'm basically doing the same stuff that I was doing on Taylor's vocal. Zach is the drummer, and so I'm definitely using the dynamic EQ stuff there, and that just helped clean up that I'm not picking up those transients for, you know, like the drums, but definitely had to, you know, wrestle with that a little bit. Okay, so I've spun ahead just a little bit and basically into the transition from the song we've been listening to, Tragic Symphony, into Got a Hold on Me. And the reason why I went here is because we'll have a listen to the piano and how it kind of sits in there, what I was trying to achieve in getting it to pop through in the mix without it getting abrasive and obnoxious and kind of plunky, but still keep some of that warmth there, but not kill it. So I'm going to play this section. It's the last couple hits in Tragic Symphony, and then into the next. So now I'm going to isolate the piano. And let me just take those couple of hits out. Using a little slower attack on the compressor too, so that the initial attack of the keyboard of the piano will cut through. And then EQ wise, just adding a shelf, starting at 1.5K, and I'll let you hear it without. So I felt it was a little bit dark, especially with all the other stuff that's happening in that mid-range. I wanted it to kind of pop for the moments where it needed to, but still keep some of the low and low mid there, that it still had a warmth to it, but cut. Now let's turn it all on, and I'll actually let it play a little further into the song. I think you'll also hear in those parts, like when he's doing the side stick, and that again, where that expansion on the snare top comes in, where that side stick just cuts and sits in there. So let's just hit that spot again. You also hear a lot more of the percussion stuff kind of start to pop out in this one. And almost has like a little bit of Latin feel to it, which is kind of nice. Actually, the tour that I was out mixing when everything did get shut down and we got locked up here with DiGiCo was Juanes and Latino artists, but man, it was a blast to mix. Fantastic bunch of people, and just great musician, great songs. And I didn't understand a word the whole night, but it was still fantastic. Hey guys, thanks for joining us today. I hope that you were able to take something from this and make it your own. We'd love to hear comments in the comments section on this video. I'd love to know if any of the little tips and tricks that work for me worked for you, and I really hope they do. I hope you're able to learn some new stuff about layout, workflows, all that kind of stuff. Lastly, I'd like to thank our friends at DiGiCo and also Claire Global for setting us up in this space, and and the console and stuff to be able to produce this video for you and impart some of what our years of being on the road into some of you that might be just learning and starting out. I really want to thank DiGiCo for the support that they've given me as well. The late night texts and phone calls. Mark and Ryan especially have gotten a few from me where I'm in some obscure place and I'm like, oh crap, how can I fix this? And they've always been very responsive, and usually within 15 to 30 minutes I've got either fixed or have the solution to fix it. So very grateful for that. And as well, Claire Global, they've supported me for many years and are a great bunch of people, Scott Hernbeck and the crew here in Nashville. That's about it. Thanks for joining us, and we hope to see you again soon. Have a good day.